Now, in a few minutes in the next video, we are going to do the final example. But before we get there, I really need to hammer this point home, which is that simple shapes are the gateway to doing complicated shapes. And I don't mean that in an abstract way. What I mean is when I see a complicated shape like this, what I do immediately is imagine it as if it were primitives. Because as you've seen, there's a certain amount of calculation that you have to do to cast shadows and to figure out where your values go. And to do that on a really complex shape is kind of overwhelming. So instead, you have to mentally reduce it into a simple object. And then you have a starting point. But that starting point is only efficient if you're totally comfortable painting these primitive shapes. And that's not something that just sort of happens automatically. What you need to do is practice. So you can see here that I have visible construction lines, and this is pretty common for me because I know I'm going to be painting over top, and so what these help me do is just envision the form. Because if all you have are strict outlines, it can be harder to look at an outline and envision these sort of cross contours. But if you leave yourself some visible construction lines, it just makes this step easier. And this step is really important. This placing the landmark phase is probably the most crucial part of the whole process. Because afterwards, then you've got sort of a coloring book that you fill in with tone. And you know how to fill in tone and you know how to mix edges. It's really just this original blueprint stage that's going to make or break your rendering. So I think about the shadow shape as a graphic. Here I'm really just giving myself a shape to then refine with tones later. But I'll just think of it first as a single tone. Then I go ahead and darken in certain areas and lighten certain areas with reflected light. And then the rest is really just polish. You know, at this point, I will often sort of flatten my document and not worry so much about layer control because now I've got it all in place. I don't have to worry about shifting things around. I'm just sort of making it look nice. In this example, it is crucial that you know where the ground plane is. And if you've watched the linear perspective series, you know that the spot where a ground plane meets a wall is a great place to start projecting from. But once again, this is the important stage. Get these shadow cast projections correct, and the rest will really all just fall into place. Now I'm going to go ahead and fill in the shadow shape as a single tone. And I happen to be using a nice marquee selection here, but you could really select this any way you wanted to. In fact, if you didn't want to paint inside the lines, you could just paint it freehand. Then I'll add a little bit of nuance inside the shadow to represent the bounce light and the occlusion shadows. I'll put in a brighter value for the ground plane and also the same value for the top of the cylinder because those have an equal angle relative to the sun direction. The back wall in the scene is much more parallel to the light direction, so it's going to be a little bit darker. And then I've got all my important stuff in place. At this point, it's just polish, soften some edges, and I'm good to go. And this one is exactly the same. I'll start with casting my shadows, and then once I've got my shadow shapes figured out, I'll lay in some flat tones, put in a brighter tone for the faces that are most tangent to the light source. In this case, it's the ground plane and the tops of the objects. And then I polish it out. So hopefully you can see here that this just takes practice. You're training your brain to recognize certain forms. You're understanding what a cylinder does. You're understanding what a cone does, which will allow you to mentally combine them together and just help you simplify more complicated forms. Now, in all these examples so far, I have been pretty rigid about the steps. You begin by casting shadows and then you lay in a flat tone. Well, that's not the way I always work. I've really sort of laid it out this way to make it clear for your benefit, because when you're learning this stuff, it's nice to have structure. But what this is all getting towards is sort of a mental shorthand. Once you've done this enough times, you just start to internalize it in a way where you don't need to follow the exact same process. As you'll see in the next demo, I jump around a little bit. And the reason I'm able to do that is because I can look at the line drawing, look at the light direction, and just sort of imagine what the shadows look like. And the reason you do boring studies like these with the basic primitives is to allow you to be able to freehand the more fun stuff. So you can't get there for free. You have to do these boring basic shapes. But every one you do is going to build those muscles. So then when it comes to drawing something more exciting, you're ready.